Welcome to Lesson 2, in which we're going to show you how to load up an existing Android project into Eclipse, run that project on an AVD, an Android virtual device, and also run that project on an actual device as well. Now, before we proceed, if you have not yet set up your Android development environment, as explained in Lesson 1, the Before You Begin lesson, you should stop here and go back to Lesson 1 now. Make sure you have your environment set up correctly, and then when you're ready, come back here to do the test drive. Now, under the assumption that you've already installed Eclipse, the first thing we're going to need to do is get it up and running on the computer. Now, I happen to be working in a Windows 7 environment, but one of the things that's nice about Android is that you can also develop for Android on Mac OS X and on Linux as well. Now, when you install Eclipse, it gets placed into a folder normally called Eclipse wherever you decide to place it on your computer. In my case, I put it on the C drive of my Windows computer. You can see that here, and here is the Eclipse folder. And when I open up that folder, and this will be true, by the way, on each of the different platforms for which you can develop Android apps, within that folder you'll see the Eclipse icon on one of the items, and in the case of Windows it's called eclipse.exe. If you have no file name extensions turned on, then it will just say Eclipse. On Mac OS and on Linux, you also want to look for this same icon and simply double click it to run the development environment. Now, when Eclipse starts running, you'll normally be presented with this Workspace Launcher dialog. And basically, Eclipse allows you to maintain many different workspaces, perhaps, for example, for different sets of projects you're working on or different programming languages, etc. So I could have a workspace that's geared towards Android development, and a workspace that's geared towards Java development, and one geared towards PHP development, and one geared towards C++ development. And based on that, you can choose which workspace you want to use in a given execution of the Eclipse IDE. So I'm just going to select the default workspace, which by default is going to be placed into your user directory. On Windows, that's C:\users / and then the name that you use to set up your account. On your own Mac or Linux boxes, it would be your personal user directory. And then it follows that with Workspace as the folder in which it's going to place any projects that you create. Now, once you click OK, the environment will continue launching, and it'll load up the various components, and then you'll be presented with this welcome page. Now, this will only show up the very first time you run the Eclipse IDE, and once you dismiss it, you will then be brought in subsequent executions of Eclipse directly into the so-called workbench area, which is where you do your actual development. However, you can always get back to this welcome screen directly from the help menu just by selecting welcome. Now, you'll notice there's some icons on the welcome screen, and if you hover over each one, it'll tell you what it's for. In this case, an overview of the IDE and its features. Then we have a What's New section for anything that's new in this version of the IDE compared to earlier versions. We also have the samples, so you can try out existing samples from the Eclipse folks. We have some tutorials to help you understand the environment, and then finally the workbench area, which I will click, and this is where we'll do our development. Now, within the workbench, there's really a couple of key areas that you're going to be concerned with. Over here in the left column, we have the so-called Package Explorer window, and this is where it will show you all the different projects that you have open in the IDE, and it allows you to manage those projects. In the center area here, this is typically where your code will be displayed, or in the case when you're designing a GUI, where the GUI design tool will be displayed. You can maintain your own task lists over here. You have an outline window, which is going to, for example, in GUI development mode, show you the hierarchy of GUI components that make up a layout that you place in an Android app. And then you have a variety of tabs down at the bottom here for things like compiler errors, which would show up in the Problems tab, or the console, which is where it displays messages indicating, for example, when you launch an app, what's going on to get that app installed onto the device and up and executing. Now, with any of the tabs in the Eclipse IDE, if you want to expand it to fill the entire window, you can simply double-click the tab name and it will take over the entire window, and if you double-click it again, it'll go back and snap into its normal space. And like many IDEs nowadays, you can drag these tabs around and organize them the way that you want for your development purposes. So for example, in subsequent lessons, we will often minimize the task list and also the outline window. And you can see that puts them in these minimized views over here on the right hand side. And if I wanted to bring those back up, I can just click them to temporarily display them, or I can indicate whether or not I want to snap them back into place. I was clicking the wrong icon there. Now, the next thing we need to do is get our project into the Eclipse IDE so that we can compile and run it. And by the way, Eclipse by default is going to continually compile your apps and any other code you develop with Eclipse in the background so that you always have the most up-to-date compiled version of your code available, and it will show you error messages as you go so that you can hopefully get your programs up and running faster. Now, to import an existing project, we're going to go to the File menu and select Import, at which point we get this import dialog. And what we want to do is, from the general category, we want to select existing projects into Workspace, because we have these existing projects that I created with Eclipse for the purpose of our book, Android for Programmers, and we're using those here in this Live Lessons product as well, and we want to bring one of those into the IDE. So we click Next, and at this point you have to specify the root directory where the project is stored. So we'll go now and click Browse, and for the purpose of this demonstration, we're assuming that you've already gone ahead and downloaded the examples from this Live Lessons product and our corresponding book and put them into a folder on your system. In my case, I put them into my computer's C drive in a folder called Examples, which you can see here. And if I expand that folder, you can see the names of some of the apps from the book and Live Lessons video product, and the one that we're concerned with in this case is the Doodles app. So if you just select the root folder for Doodles and click OK, it will insert the location of that in the Select Root Directory text field. Now again, you'll want to make sure that you've downloaded and expanded the examples folders onto your system. Keep track of where you place them so you can browse to the correct location. Now at this point we can simply go ahead and hit Finish, and it will load up this existing project into the Package Explorer window within Eclipse. If you want, you can select this checkbox here that says Copy Projects into Workspace, and instead of just referencing the Doodles program on disk where it currently resides, it will copy the entire Doodles folder into your Workspace folder. In our case here, we're simply going to leave that unchecked and hit the Finish button. So now we have the Doodles project over here in our Package Explorer window, and if you want, you can expand the nodes and see that we have some source code, and one of the folders we'll be dealing a lot with is this res folder, which has various subfolders underneath. So you can see the whole project structure there if you like. But for this particular demo, the key thing that we need to do next is show you how to get this app up and running using an AVD, an Android Virtual Device. And of course you set those Android Virtual Devices up back in Lesson 1, the before you begin lesson. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click the Doodles app, and from the menu that shows up I'm going to select Run as Android Application. Now before I click that, I just want to point out that if you don't have an Android Virtual Device up and running right now, what it's going to try to do is launch an Android Virtual Device that uses the same version of Android as the version you used for developing the app, And if it can't find one of those, it will try to use a compatible version. So for example, an Android 2.2 app should be able to run not only on an Android 2.2 virtual device, but also on an Android 2.3 virtual device as well. And if in fact you already have an Android virtual device up and running, then what it will do is simply try to install this app onto that already running device. And in fact, to save some time here, I have one already up and running because it does take some time to initially launch an Android virtual device. So to save time in the video, I started it before beginning the recording of the video. So let me go ahead and select Android application and switch over. Excuse me, let me talk about this window first that popped up. So here we have the so-called Android Device Chooser dialog. Now this will only get displayed if you have either multiple Android virtual devices up and running on your computer, multiple actual Android devices connected to your computer, or a combination of the two. Now at this moment in time, I happen to have both an Android virtual device called Nexus S up and running, and an actual Android device running a version of Android called Android 2.3.6 up and running as well. And you can choose which thing you want to run this app on. Now I'm going to disconnect the second device here, the actual device, and now we see just the one Android emulator up and running. And to demonstrate, I'm just going to cancel here and start this one more time, and this time it will go directly to the install phase in my Nexus S virtual machine that's up and running. And after doing the install, it immediately runs the app, and you can see doodles showing up in the title bar here at the top of the AVD window. And for this app, it doesn't have a graphical user interface, it's just a white drawing area, and by default you can draw in black using a relatively thin line. So for example, I'll write out the word welcome here to demonstrate my poor artistic talent. And you'll notice, by the way, there's some delay between my mouse movements and the actual drawing on the screen, and this is actually a problem with the AVDs in general. They are a bit slow, and this is something that Google is actually working on. So at some point we should expect to see more performance out of the AVDs so that you can actually test your apps a little bit easier within them. But this is a good time to point out that it's often better, if you have the possibility of testing on real devices, to do that, because they are going to perform much better than the AVD. So there is my welcome, and this app has some other options available as well, which we can get to via buttons that are provided within the AVD. Now, on a typical Android phone at this point in time, you will normally have hard buttons and soft buttons. Hard buttons are actual buttons on the phone itself. So many Android phones, for example, have buttons that look similar to these four over here on the right side. A home button to go to the home screen of the device. A menu button, which is often just displayed as four horizontal lines. A back button, which is usually an arrow kind of like the one here, and a search button. And they're not necessarily in that same order on each device, but this is typical of most Android phones nowadays. And when you hit the menu button on your phone or your device, it's going to pop up this app's menu, which has various options that we can choose from. Now, before I go back to those options, let's just talk about the other buttons that you see here. So I mentioned the concept of hard buttons. Soft buttons are buttons that show up on the screen of the device. So for example, on today's Android tablets, and most likely on Android phones going forward as well, since Android 4.0 was just released around the time that I was recording this video, you're typically going to have only soft buttons going forward. So even things like the home button and the back button, etc., and the menu button are going to be built into the screen presentation of the, I'll call it the desktop of the device, the home screen of the device, if you will. The other buttons that you see here are things like navigation buttons. Some phones have navigation buttons for moving around inside of a GUI. Many phones have buttons for making a call and hanging up from a call. We also have buttons for the camera, lowering the volume, increasing the volume, and turning the device on and off. And when you're dealing with an app that has text input, they provide in the AVD a keyboard that allows you to do text input, and you can even use the keyboard on your computer as well. Many Android devices also have built-in keyboards, either directly on the device or via a slide-out keyboard as well. So basically all of these buttons on the right side here are used to emulate buttons on actual Android devices, and in some cases with things like the keyboard, the app will simply display a soft keyboard on the screen if in fact a hard keyboard is not available. Now going back over to our app, we saw that when we pressed the menu button, these 5 options appeared. And we can choose what color we'd like to draw in. We can choose a line width. We can turn our fingers, or in this case the mouse pointer, into erasers. We can clear the image entirely, and we can save the image into the device's gallery, which we'll take a look at doing after we've finished this demo. So let's say we want to change the color. We'll click color and we'll be presented with our choose color dialog, which allows us to set the red, green, and blue portions of a color as well as the alpha value, the transparency value. So for example, let's say we wanted to draw in red. You can see as I drag the slider, the color swatch is changing down below. And if I wanted to get some amount of transparency here, I can change the alpha, and you see it looks like it's becoming pinker, and that's because in the background there's a white color swatch. So when I have 0 for the alpha, no red is being drawn, and when I have 255 for the alpha, which is the highest value, 100% red is being drawn in this case. So if I want to set the color, I can go ahead and hit set color, and let's say I draw the word 2. Again, I'm not very good at drawing in general, so welcome to. And let's say we want to change the color one more time. This time, let's say we want to draw in blue. Whoops, that's the wrong slider. So we'll select blue in this case and get rid of our red value. And we'll set the color. And let's also go ahead and set the line thickness so you can see that dialog as well. And as I drag, you can see that the line gets thicker. And we'll just write the word Android to finish up our demo here. Very slowly, I might add. Oops. Okay, so that finishes up the basic options for our Doodles app. And again, if I hit the menu button, I could demonstrate erasing by turning the drawing color into white, which is how the eraser works. So if I then drag over the drawing area and I happen to hit a spot that's got color in it, it will just convert that spot to white in the background. I could clear the image, but if I did that, then I'd lose all this hard work I just did. Let's go ahead and save the image, and it'll then tell me that my painting has been saved to the gallery. It doesn't give me an option of giving a file name, it just assigns a default file name to each file that I create. But that image is now in the device's gallery like any other photo that you might take with the device's camera. You can go ahead and hit the home button, and when you do that you can then hit the button for the list of applications, and there is the gallery app, which we could then open and take a look at the saved images. Now if I go back to the Doodles app once again, if I'd like to demonstrate some of the other options here, I can hit the erase button, and you'll notice that I can now erase stuff. And separately, if I hit the menu button and hit clear, you can see that the entire image is now erased. So we've now demonstrated how to load up an app into Eclipse and run it on an existing AVD. And now what I'd like to do is talk about the process of running an app on an actual Android device. So I'm going to go ahead and plug back in my Nexus S phone, and you can hear it connecting to the computer there. And now what we're going to do is show you how to run on an actual device. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and right click my project and select Run As and Android Application. Now before I do that, recall from before that we were presented with a dialog that allows us to choose which device we want to run. So now let's go ahead and click Android Application, and once again we have this Android Device Chooser dialog. Now again, you will only be presented with this if in fact you have more than one AVD, device, or combination of the two up and running and connected to the computer. So in this case I have the emulator, which we just demonstrated, and I have my actual device. This is the serial number for my actual device, and if I select that and click OK, we can switch over now to a video of the actual device, and you can see my Doodles app is indeed up and running. And if I hit the menu button, you can see the menu options showing up. And so let's say I just want to do a quick drawing here, so I'll write welcome very poorly. I'm running out of space. It's a little harder to do it with my finger than it is with the mouse on a regular screen here. And of course we can change our drawing color, and let's change our thickness, and now we'll draw a green line. And so you can see that indeed we are able to run this on a real device. Now part of what you need to do to allow this to happen in the first place is to set up your device for debugging. And to do that, we can go to the Settings app on the device. So let me go ahead and pull that up here. And within the Settings app we go to Applications, and then we go to Development, and you'll notice here that I have USB debugging is checked and Stay Awake is also checked. Now USB debugging must be checked to allow you to connect your device to a computer and install apps onto it. And Stay Awake is important if you want to keep the device awake while you're doing your testing. If you want it to be allowed to go to sleep as part of your testing, then you'll want to make sure that the checkbox for Stay Awake is unchecked. So that's one key thing that you need to be doing in order to allow you to connect your device to your computer and install an app onto it. Now for Windows users, there is something else that you're going to need to do. And for that, I'm going to go to the Google website for Android, and specifically to this page, developer.android.com/sdk/win-usb.html. On Windows, you need USB drivers in order to be able to work with an actual device and install apps onto that device. So this page talks about how to download the Google USB driver, which is actually one of the items that we had you download during the Before You Begin lesson, and also how to install that device driver. Now for those of you who are working on Mac OS X or Linux, you're going to want to refer to this other page, which I will open in a separate tab here. And on this page it talks about how to set up a device for development, and it gets into the details of things you need to do specifically for Linux. And in the case of Mac OS X, there's really not a whole lot you have to do. It just kind of works for you on that platform. So those of you using Mac OS and doing Android development are in pretty good shape already. Now another key piece for the Windows users with regard to the USB driver is that the Google USB driver does not work for all devices. So you'll notice over here on the right side there's this link, OEM USB drivers. OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturers. And if you click that link, it brings you lower down on the page, and these are links to various Android phone and other device manufacturers where you can download USB drivers for the purpose of connecting your devices to Windows computers in particular. And again, you won't need to deal with this on Mac OS at all. In the case of Linux, there are some things you need to do, but you don't have to separately install these device drivers. So again, just summarizing what we've seen in this lesson, We showed you how to launch Eclipse, how to import a project into Eclipse, an existing project, how to run an existing project on an AVD, and again, we assume that you had set that up back in the Before You Begin section. And then finally, after test driving the app, we also demonstrated the app running on an actual device by connecting that device to our computer and installing the app onto that device.